We can start our, nobody ever told me I didn't project enough, but we could start our second session of the morning, which is on breaking geographical boundaries. I found it interesting when Jen asked me to introduce this, breaking boundaries in general, because I was educated in the bounded environment of a very bounded institution where it was all Egypt all the time. And I think Egyptology has come a long way. Pinar was talking about relationships with Mesopotamia. I could mention the CM project, which unfortunately is not as well known among Egyptologists as perhaps it should be, which was Manfred Bitak's attempt to synchronize the chronologies of the Eastern Mediterranean in the second millennium using every scientific and archaeological and historical tool that was available, dendrochronology, carbon-14. It's led to a lot of arguments about carbon-14. Our two speakers today will be talking about sites that Egyptologists up until now would not have been working on. They are less monumental, less funerary, and they're not within the Nile Valley. They exemplify commercial interests, colonial interests, or situations, I should say, colonial aspects, the idea of living in a foreign country, what we were talking about last night of entanglements. I think a site like Tel Adaba is a classic entanglement. It's so entangled that we spend a great deal of time trying to figure out who were these people. Were they Egyptians? Were they from the southern Levant? Were they from the northern Levant? How did they get there? How long had they been there? Questions that would not have been answered or asked earlier in Egyptology. There's also been a great deal of work done in the western deserts. One of the earliest projects, the Theban Desert Road Survey, which showed that the Egyptians weren't terrified of going 2 feet outside the cultivation. The work done in the other oases showing provincial administration, provincial communities, centers of political and cultural life, where they may have displayed Egyptian affinities, were their own people. The second intermediate period, Ichtawi in the north, they didn't turn out the lights and go home. People continued to interact with polities, commercial settlements, and people in the Delta and in Nubia and in Upper Egypt. Our two speakers for the second session are Gregory Marouard from the University of Chicago and Neal Spencer from the British Museum. The first paper is on the screen, yes. Sorry. Is Gregory Marouard talking about the harbor installations at the Wadi al-Jarf and the Lake Menzaleh area, the ed-Dahab. I would be very interested in that, having worked at Mendes, which again was a port city at its time. He has worked extensively in Egypt. There's a long list of sites all the way from the Delta down out to the oases, into Islamic Cairo, and back. He is currently working, in addition to the Wadi al-Jarf and the Lake Menzaleh project, at Tel Edfu with the Oriental Institute project there, which has brought very interesting information on the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period to light, and also at Dendra, and I'm very interested to hear what will be coming out of that site. Neal Spencer is keeper of the Department of Ancient Egypt and the Sudan at the British Museum, which I think is one of the most dynamic and exciting museum departments of Egyptology going at the moment. with an encyclopedic collection of enormous depth. And he will be speaking about their work at the Nubian site, or the site in Nubia, of Amara. We have to be careful with labels now. And the work that they've been doing there to understand the people who lived and died there. Each of the speakers will have 20 minutes, and I guess I'll hold up 5 fingers when you get to that point.
This will be quite difficult. I will try to do my best. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Laura, Miriam, and Jen for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. That's my first time in Brown, and that's my task today, to be your Anthony Bourdain on CNN, you know, parts unknown. So we'll do the parts unknown of Egypt. But it's really difficult for me to summarize in 20 minutes the past 15 years of fieldwork that we have done in this geographic boundaries of Egypt. So I have originally prepared a long introduction about the history of the exploration of the deserts and all this phenomenon, but I have just no time, so I will just stick on the coastal installation, and I will start to bring geographical boundaries, because I don't feel comfortable here. I prefer to be next to the site. And if you don't hear correctly, just let me know. I can speak louder. So during the past 15 years, the Egyptian archaeology completely destroyed this boundary, this geographic boundary about the coastal installation. Today, I will mostly discuss about 2 sites, and because these sites are quite different on a chronological point of view, it's really difficult to make connections, so I will present the first one and the second one. So the first site is a little bit more famous now, thanks to the very beautiful discoveries we did in 2013. So this is the Wadi al-Jarf. We are on the coast of the Gulf of Suez. That's not an American excavation, that's a French project of the French Institute and the University Paris-Sorbonne, and that's my friend and colleague Pierre Tallet, who is the director of this project. So he's, since a few days, he's officially the chair Egyptologist at Paris-Sorbonne. So this site is only dated to the reign of Khufu. And this is not a trade harbor. This is an expeditionary harbor used by expedition that left the Nile Valley in direction to the southern Sinai. The second example is far north in the delta. It's one of the northernmost sites of the delta so far, and it's a Roman foundation. It's an ex nihilo foundation, probably an emporion. And the common points between these 2 sites is not only their location on the boundaries or the function. The common point between them is a very short life. So for this harbor, it's no more than maybe 25 or 50 years of occupation. But this one is 3 centuries. It's really short, but massive installations. And the other common point between these 2 sites are the fact that 5 years ago, they were completely unknown. And these 2 sites were only discovered thanks to satellite images. So we did not run on the BBC or CBS to claim that we discovered something. We verified before, and we did a lot of field work, which is much wiser, I guess. So before these 2 sites, we have already a couple of information about the harbor settlements. And one of the first excavation was done by Donald Whitcomb from the DOI at Kosa Kadim. And after Vileke can tell us a little bit more about that. The second big excavation was at Berenike here, the middle of the 90s. A few years after, another team excavated Marsa in this area, which is a small Roman installation. And also at the turn of the year 2000, we have some expedition that start to work at Taposeis Magna, which is a French mission, at Marouard, a Polish mission. And I should also mention the work of Jean-Yves Empereur or Frank Gaudiot in the Alexandria and Heraclean area. But all these sites are from the Greek or Roman period. And 15 years ago, we had almost nothing about the Egyptian harbor, and we changed completely this vision. So here are just a few key points about the Pharaonic harbors that I will show you. The first thing, they are clearly linked to the royal expedition, and for the Red Sea, they are only connected to royal expedition that were sent through the desert and on the Red Sea in order to collect the metals, stone, gems, generally in two directions, the southern Sinai Peninsula, and the second direction is the distant land of Punt. On all these sites and during this expedition, there is systematically a navigation section. And for that, the ancient Egyptians generally used some boats that they built in the Nile Valley. So in the shipyard in the Nile Valley, they built the boat, they dismantled the boat, they crossed the desert, they reassembled the boat on the seashore, and then they crossed the sea in direction to Sinai or Punt. So since 2000, as I mentioned here, 6 projects are working in about this topic, and in 3 years we discovered 3 harbors. So the first one is here, Marsa Gawasis. We're next to Safaga. The site was in fact discovered in 1976 by an Egyptian scholar, but at that point it was not considered as an harbor installation, but just a memorial of the expedition to Punt. And in the early years of 2000, a team led by Rodolfo Fatulich and Catherine Bard started to excavate this site, and they showed that that was a real harbor with installations. So there is galleries used for storage. There's multiple nautical elements, fragments of wood. Generally, it's cedar imported from the Lebanon, and a lot of inscription, official reports, still private names, and this site definitely confirmed the fact that they crossed the desert with dismantled boats and reassembled the things on the sea. The second site, on which I worked for about 12 years, is Sokhna. So for this site, the main direction was mostly the Sinai Peninsula, but we have some indication for also long-distance travel to Punt during the 5th dynasty. This site is probably the most important harbor installation, much more important than Marsa Gawasi, not only in terms of size and installation, it's because we have more than 20 different expeditions recorded at the site, and clear evidence for at least 12 different pharaohs. This site was probably opened during the reign of Khafra, with a continuous occupation during the entire 5th dynasty and early 6th dynasty until Pepi II. After we have a break during the first intermediate period, and we have a clear attestation for the first 3 kings of the Middle Kingdom, and after we have a break until Amenemhat III. This break is actually corresponding exactly to the occupation of Marsa Gawasis. So the first conclusion I can make on this one, no one of this harbor work at the same time. They are intermittent. We use Sokhna, then Marsa Gawasis, and again Sokhna. So in 2009, we organized the first workshop about the question, and we brought together all the actors of the Red Sea. But 3 years after, we started to work at the site at Wadi al-Jarf, and we confirmed this aspect and all these elements of the harbor installation. But this site is 4 times bigger than the others, and is the first one only used during the reign of King Khufu, and it was abandoned at the end of this reign. And it's probably the prototype of the harbor installation. So you will see that we found many elements. So just to give you an idea about the location, we are here south of Zafarana, about 100 kilometers south of Sokhna, and just opposite to the Southern Sinai Peninsula. We start to survey this area in 2008 with my colleague Yann Tristan for the French Institute also. And in 2015, we discover in this section next to the monastery San Antonio, a huge trail, which is actually visible on satellite images. It's 8 meters wide. It's like a highway that we were able to follow on more than 25 kilometers. And all along this path, we found 4th Dynasty pottery sherds, and we found also potsherds produced at the Wadi Jarf. So we can consider basically that this trail is probably the access to the Wadi Jarf, and the Wadi Araba made a very direct link between the Nile Valley and the Gulf of Suez. Opposite to the Wadi Jarf, so you see you have just 50 kilometers to cross for the Red Sea. Just opposite to the Wadi Jarf, you have here at the Wadi Marouard, which was a huge area for copper and turquoise mining. We have evidence for Khufu with this official report. And on the shore, you have this fortress, which was excavated by Gregory in the early years of 2000. And this fortress is not a later kingdom fortress. It's an early 4th Dynasty fortress. And this is definitely the bridgehead of the Wadi Jarf. So Wadi Jarf is multipolar. It's not on one side, it's on both sides of the Red Sea. And you can see that the main site is also divided in multiple areas, so the site extends on more than 5 kilometers. And this is thanks again to the satellite images that we rediscovered the site in 2008, but it took us 3 years to get the permission. It's a quite difficult area to excavate because in general you need about 12 different authorizations from various corps of army, security, police. And we have generally a full-time guy working for 3 months for all the applications. That's the only way to be sure to excavate every year. So we discover the site thanks to the satellite images, and I show you here a kite view of the underwater pier that we discovered, which is the monumental part of the harbor installation. This is so far the oldest harbor ever discovered in the world. And you can see these small dots here, and in this one, there are actually both anchors that we found underwater. And we also found these big jars, these big containers underwater. They are locally produced, and 80% of the jars discovered at the Tel Ras Boudran fortress on the opposite side are of this kind with this fabric. So it's clearly here these jars that make a direct link between the two sides. I show you this picture because in 2011, when we started to work at the site, we were extremely lucky, and we had this full moon eclipse at the very beginning of the season. So extremely low tide, and it was extremely helpful for us because with a differential GPS and a total station, we were able to make a map of all the underwater remains and a bathymetric map. So with all the levels. So we were lucky for that, definitely. We also recording the things by using kite because, you know, we have to excavate a part of the things with the tide. So every day the excavation is covered by the water, so we have to be fast for recording. So, and unfortunately we cannot use drones in Egypt so far, so we're doing that in a very traditional way. And I will not develop too much on that because we can discuss this question with Principal later today. We did also underwater archaeology this year, and I can develop a little bit on the difficulties to get the permits to do that. So next to the underwater pier, we have massive installation, mostly for dwelling and for storage, and we found evidence for administrative activities. And on the floor of this storage building, we found multiple seal impressions, all naming the King Khufu. And this one is particularly interesting. We have a few examples of it. You have, I don't know if it's visible here, you have the mention of Arret Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which is the name of the Great Pyramid at Giza. So these documents are clearly give us a precise datation for the use and the abandonment of the building, and it makes a direct connection between this harbor and the complex and the pyramid complex in the Giza area. I show you also this huge concentration of anchors. We have stored inside this building 105 anchors, and they were all stored at the same time for the final closure of the site. This season, we start to excavate this building, which is so far the largest building ever discovered on the Red Sea coast, for the Pharaonic period, I mean. And the only parallel to such a building is also in the pyramid complex. So you can make connection between this building with long, narrow rooms with the ed-Dahab galleries excavated by Mark Lehner. We have similar installation next to the Khafra pyramid, but the most interesting comparison are the workmen barracks that the Germans found south of the Red Pyramid at Dashur, which is basically more or less synchronous to this installation. So that's the only other examples we have for Egypt. So one more time, we're making here a link with the pyramid complex with such a building, which was probably only devoted to the as dormitory for the troop. We did this work this year. It was extremely frustrating because we found floor very clean, almost nothing left. But as you can see, we excavate under the floor, and we found a previous phase, which is also dating back from the reign of Khufu. So we have two phases of building, but two phases of Khufu, maybe two expeditions. And you see these little transversal walls. They are later reinstallation. At that point, the building was already filled with about 50 centimeters of natural sand. And this reinstallation, we found multiple seal impression with the name of Khafra. So basically, this building was completely abandoned and already filled with sand about 20 years after. You know, that's the difference in time between Khafra, Khufu, and Khafra. Oh, just a picture to show you this is, it looks really idyllic area, but the coastal plain, there is absolutely no obstacle. So we work in March and April during the Hamshir and Hamsin season. So every weeks we have a very strong storm, and generally we have to leave the sites because it's just impossible to excavate. More inside, we have the camp area. I will not develop because we did not start excavation on it, but this is actually thanks to this part of the site that we rediscovered Wadi al-Jarf in 2008. And here, 500 meters south of the camps, we have this huge set of galleries. So the galleries are a component of all the Pharaonic harbors that we have. We know 4 to 6 galleries at Marsa Gawasis, 10 in Sokhna. We have 30 galleries here. And most of them were completely filled with these sediments, but they are extremely well cut and very easy to excavate because we have not a big stratigraphic thickness in this on such a site. So we are quite fast, and after 4 campaigns, we excavate all these galleries here. The biggest one is actually 34 meters in length. The main function of these galleries was the storage of wooden pieces. I tell you that because in Sokhna we found in 2 of the 10 galleries, we found 2 galleries with massive remains of a boat dismantled. This boat is from the Middle Kingdom. And we have exactly the same system of small low walls that were used to support probably the wooden beams. And we have also found, we are still at Wadi al-Jarf here, we also found many evidences for the storage of wooden pieces. Most of them are made with cedar from Lebanon, and they were used for reconstructing the boats. The galleries were also used for the storage of these big storage jars. So this is exactly the same that we have underwater, and that's the same that you have on the other side of the Red Sea. And they were locally produced, so I cannot show you all the detail, but we have a perfect preserved workshop with all the steps. We have the wheel table, we have the tools, we have the ropes, we have all the unfired pieces, we have the clay pits, we have all the steps of the production, and we have also the chance to have some inscription on maybe 40% of the jars. Generally, that's the name of a team. And for example, we have 3 different names of teams on this jar. And for example, this one is quite interesting because the name of the team is built on the golden Horus name of Khufu. One more time. So it's Khufu all around. So at the very end of the use of that site, all the galleries were closed by a very massive system. They're actually using blocks. This is 1 meter, just to give you an idea of the size. They are between 5 to 15 tons. So it's a pyramid size for the blocks. And all the galleries were closed with this portcullis system. And generally they put plaster between the blocks in order to avoid the water to enter the gallery. So it just emphasized the precious aspect of the things stored in these galleries. And the space between were filled with rubbles. We have also a lot of everyday life objects, and we were extremely lucky at the entrance of G1 because we found a huge deposit of papyrus. This is not a deposit. They trashed this papyrus exactly like they trashed the everyday life object that we found here. So these papyrus are quite important because they are so far the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered in Egypt. And they also give us tons of information that I cannot show you today. It's just too much. I can talk 2 hours on that. So we have 2 categories. The first categories are the accounts, list, and receipt. And this one is an iconic document for us because it gives us a clear date. We are the year after the 30th census of large and small cattle, which means the year 26 or 27 of the reign of King Khufu, which is the last year that we know so far. You have here the Horus name of Khufu, and here you have the name Shamsu Apel, you have the name of the team, which is actually built on the name of Khufu also. And if you remember on the jars, that's exactly the same name of the team that we have on jars. So you see all the documents and archaeological evidence and also inscribed evidence are connecting really well together here. The second category of papyrus have absolutely nothing to do with the ed-Dahab, but we found them at the ed-Dahab, but most of the information we got there are the activities of the team conducted by the inspector Marouard. And most of the activities at the beginning, well, I cannot go too much in detail, but on this papyrus, for example, they're recording activities of transporting blocks from the Turak quarries upstream the Nile, and after we go to the pyramid complex. So basically 300 kilometers from the pyramid complex, we found documents that explaining a lot of things about the different operation. Just to show you here, we have one more time Khufu, which is the name of the pyramid, and Merer. And this diary is absolutely incredible. It's a real account of time. So every day this team record the activities that they've done. And they're not only working for transporting blocks, they're also working on a dam at the entrance of the lake at Giza. They're working at the construction of a pier in the Nile Delta. So multiple information. And some of these papyrus are actually processed for publication, and I hope that the things will be available at the end of the year. So this is just the kind of operation described in the papyrus. And before jumping for the other side, I'm probably completely out of time. 5 minutes? I have 5 minutes left, or 5 minutes too much?
Well, you're a little over now, but
So this is the kind of map that we are able to draw now for this area. 15 years ago, the only thing we knew were the inscription in all this mining area. And now we can start to rebuild something more complicated through the Wadis. So we'll start with the Al-Jarf, and I will show you this other site, the ed-Dahab, which is also a brand new discovery from 2011. So we're jumping 2,600 years in the future, and we're at the turn of the Roman period. We're probably mid-1st century BC. And in this area of the Lake Menzaleh, which is a very changing landscape, here in blue is the limit of the lake in 1969. And you can see that in a few years, this lake changed completely and reduced, and the water is actually is lower almost every year. You can see also that in 69, the site was still an island 5 kilometers from the lake shore, and now the island is just 2 kilometers. So during the Roman times, the ed-Dahab was probably an island located in this lake Menzaleh, which was at that point a lagoon widely open on the Mediterranean Sea. And this site is the strategic location of this site clearly underlined here an emporion function. And here you have the Damietta branch, for which we think that this location is dating back to the 5th century AD, no more. And it could be possible that during the Roman times and even before, the Damietta branch did not run to the Mediterranean area in this direction, but just go there in the Menzaleh Lake area. So a perfect position for receiving the goods from the Levant or Cyprus, transloading the goods and changing the kind of boat, and after moving fast on the Nile branch in direction to Sebenitos, for example. So is that clear? It's not very clear. So 2007, this is the kind of satellite images we have. And 2011, bingo. 2011, we have this very clear view of the site, which was completely untouched and completely unknown before. And you can see the straight line, so apparently a Nipodamean grid, really well organized. The site is quite big, it's 40 hectares. And this is a kind of map I was able to draw only with the satellite images and before going on the site. And as you can see, we have several monumental installations on which I will discuss a little bit more. I will switch this one. So the site, as I told you, is still 2 kilometers from the lake shore. So there is no way. The only way to access is just taking a boat. It will take you 45 minutes, something like that, with a motorboat when you are lucky, and take all these small canals between the reeds. And after, you have to make your path to the site. And when you arrive to the site, there is nothing. There is absolutely nothing visible on the surface. So the satellite images looks extremely promising, but the surface is completely flat. There is almost no shards. But the things were so visible with the satellite images is because of the difference in moisture between the walls and the empty areas around. And also because at the end of the summer, because of the hot weather, you have this crust of salt on the top of the wall. So it makes the things really visible. So before starting any survey, we decided to cover as much as possible the site with a kite in order to make a picture, because as you can see, the surface is so untouched and that when you're walking on the top, your imprints are going really deep, about 10 centimeters. So if you just let the team of, we were five in the team, plus 15 Egyptian, plus 15 policemen. I will not describe here the security issue. So if you just let people going all around, it's a nightmare, and you can lose a lot of information. So Neal, if you remember the Torah houses, here we have 3 good examples here of Roman Torah houses. So we did usual pottery survey after the kite, and the interesting thing, we have a lot of importation. Eastern sigillata imported in Flora, and I just showed you this little picture because of the moisture in the soil, the sherds are literally exploding in chips. So it makes the identification and the survey extremely difficult, and generally it's mostly the imported pottery that can be preserved because the quality is better than the Egyptian production, no offense. And I just show you this picture because the birds are collecting these chips in order to make the nest. So you can see that the site is untouched, but that's the ecosystem, and we're actually changing the surface. So we collect everything on spots. We study the thing on spot in order to disturb as less as possible the site. We also surveyed coins and glass, a lot of importation, and we did a geomagnetic survey in 6 different areas on about 4 hectares. So I will not describe the geomagnetic survey here because all archaeologists are probably familiar. I can be more precise with the question. And we decided to cover several areas. I will just show you 2 here today, zone 3 and 4. So this area was looted by bulldozers between 2004 and 2007. Here is a picture from 2011. 2014, you can see that there is, I can go back, there is more looting. So after the Egyptian revolution, we have this time, well, they tried to test the site. And here is a picture from September 2015, 2 weeks before I came to the site. It was refilled. The Antiquity Service locally don't want to be in trouble, so they went to the site when they knew that I made the application. They went to the site and they discovered the looting, so they backfilled everything. So unfortunately for archaeologists, that was a very bad decision because this kind of looting can be extremely helpful. You can recut the profile, get some sherds from context and not from the surface. And that also create a huge disturbance on the geomagnetic survey. So you see all this area, that's all the area refilled by the antiquity. But next to this area, which looked extremely promising because we had column bases and piece of columns, we decided to survey next to it, and we were quite lucky finding this building which looks like a very traditional Roman temple, nothing Egyptian. And I just put you here a comparison from England. And we have other kind of monuments which are definitely not Egyptian, like this theater, which is the fifth example of theater for Egypt. And it was already visible on the Colonial images from '69. So here is just a way to show you that we did the survey with the kite before in order to reconstruct the surface. So we actually using photoscan in order to make this orthophotogrammetry and this 3D view. And here's the results of the geomagnetic survey on the theater area. So you see perfectly well here the cavea, but we discovered this big building on the side, which is directly connected to the monument, and that's not visible in satellite images. We have also these 2 strange installations on the back. And here is the original grid of the town. So the original grid is somewhere in the middle of the 1st century BC, and this area is probably mid of the 2nd century AD. So I'm done. I know that I'm completely out. I just want to finish with the 3 slides because it's not only for the harbor archaeology and working on the coast. That's all these sites are connected with also the Eastern Desert and Western Desert sites and survey and exploration. Most of the archaeological mission in these areas are canceled, actually. The Sinai, for example, is completely closed in 3 to 4 years. So, unfortunately, the interest of this site is in proportion. The interest of this site is in proportion to the threats we're actually facing. So we have here this fortress recently presented by Jim Harrier at the RC conference. I think that was 2 years ago, so it was already destroyed by bulldozers. The desert, because of the gold minings, is actually for sale. So this company, Sitamin, is making a lot of money every year because Egypt is actually the second most interesting country for gold mining. And this is also some post-revolution consequences for site. And I'm just making here a bridge to the session for this afternoon about the political situation. So thank you.
I'm not a Mac user, so bear with me for a second. Or is it on the desktop? Okay. So, good late morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to thank the organisers, Laurel, Miriam and Jennifer especially, for inviting me here. It's my first time in Brown as well. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to take you further upstream into Nubia, and a lot of what I'm going to say is going to resonate with some of the earlier talks, and particularly, of course, Stuart's keynote lecture last night, and I dare say I might slip into some of the other sessions, other session themes, particularly on methodologies. So, to get going, as with many archaeologies of colonialism, the nature of Egypt's relationship with its southern neighbour Nubia in the 2nd millennium BC has long been couched in solely Pharaonic terms: military conquest, cultural influence, and Nubian submission. The narrative framework has been informed yet conditioned by a large data set of Egyptian inscriptions extolling kings, pious and loyal officials, and to a lesser extent the administrators, with no written Nubian sources to act as balance or check. Furthermore, we should not underestimate the historiographical conditioning that has shaped this framework. Nubia was until quite recently explored, excavated and then researched by those who had passed through Egypt, literally, and indeed were mostly trained as Egyptologists, while the state of Sudan itself experienced British and Anglo-Egyptian periods of rule during the late 19th and 20th centuries, when of course many of the first scholarly narratives of the history and settlements of Nubia were first formulated. Of course, we've seen a rebalancing in the last few decades, particularly through research projects that have been led by specialists that weren't trained as Egyptologists, and the embracing of interpretive frameworks created beyond the Nile Valley, and of course the ever-increasing range of available scientific methodologies. And I think I'd like to highlight 4 concurrent research projects in Upper Nubia that are embodying this new approach. So the Cambridge Austrian Institute mission at Sesebe, the German and French mission at Sai, Stuart and Michelle's work at Tombos that we heard about yesterday, and Amara West, which I'm going to speak about today. So I want to draw upon some of our research strands in this project, which we've been running since 2008. We're investigating lived experience, but against the environmental, bioarchaeological and cultural context. And I want to draw upon these strands to question the extent and the impact of the Pharaonic state in determining and shaping the town, its inhabitants, the activities that took place and its purpose, and thereby consider alternative agencies. Just a quick introduction to the site for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's located downstream of the Third Cataract, about 170 kilometres south of Wadi Halfa. It was first excavated in the 1930s and 1940s by the Egypt Exploration Society, and since then has been recognised as the seat of the Deputy of Kush, the most senior Egyptian administrator in Upper Nubia, from the in the Ramesside period, on the basis of in situ inscriptions within a residential building. And ever since, I think its creation, its existence, and ultimately its abandonment have been viewed through this lens of the Pharaonic state. Now, as I said, we started work in 2008, and I was drawn to the site really by the level of preservation. Little has changed since 1949, 1950, when the EES left. But it's also the potential to deploy a wide range of scientific analysis to research the lived experience. And here I have to thank my colleagues from the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums in Sudan, who have a very enlightened view of the concessions they grant, particularly being generous in allowing archaeological samples, skeletal material, and indeed objects to be exported, whether permanently or on short-term loan, enabling the range of high-resolution analysis to take place, which, as we all know, is presently quite difficult in Egypt. I think our project also benefits from seeing settlement and cemetery areas as part of one urban sphere experienced by its ancient inhabitants. As we all know, the inhabitants of towns built the tombs, buried their dead there, prepared burial goods within the houses and workshops, and visited the cemeteries to commemorate the dead, to reuse tombs, and in some cases, of course, to loot tombs. But I think it's worth highlighting in today's workshop how rare it is for projects to deal with both the settlement area and the cemetery. And this is largely to do with the history of Egyptology, the history of very long-standing concessions. There are, of course, some notable examples, for example, at Tel El Amarna. Now, at first glance, the plan of Amara West reflects a state template for foundations implanted in its colonies or border areas to control territory, access to resources, or monitor the movement of people. Founded in the reign of Seti I, this walled town, with its buttressed enclosure and corner towers, mirrors other Dynasty 19 foundations at Aksha in Nubia, but also, for instance, at al-Raqam on the Mediterranean coast. At Amara West, a brightly coloured west gate was adorned with scenes of Pharaoh vanquishing Nubians, and the sandstone temple you can see here had courts, halls and sanctuaries with decoration showing Pharaoh before the Egyptian gods and further battle scenes. The town is notable for its lack of wide roads, its lack of open spaces, or indeed arenas for display, such as pylons or processional avenues. As I mentioned, there was a formal residence building with these, this is one example of the inscriptions mentioning the deputy of Kush. But many of the other buildings in the earliest incarnation of the town, presumably when it was closest to how the Pharaonic state envisioned it, seemed dedicated to storage, chiming rather well with our view of the Pharaonic state extracting natural resources, particularly gold, from Nubia. A fine quartzite statue of the scribe of gold counting Amenemhat, now in the Brooklyn Museum, was set up in the temple, attesting to the presence of state representatives monitoring the flow of that most precious commodity. But something is missing. Where are the rows of houses? Where do people live in this state foundation? Such planned housing is familiar from the Middle Kingdom forts, as we know, but also Sesebe, shown here, where mere decades before Amara West was created, a new town complex was built, or rebuilt, I should say, in late Dynasty 18, with a series of terraced houses, both large and small, to the bottom of the slide. Such housing is seemingly absent from Amara West, though our excavations did encounter a series of small buildings, most likely houses, tucked away in the bottom left or southwest corner of the walled town. Now, they're not laid out to the same plan. Certain elements are repeated, a square central room with a hearth, small rooms to either side. To me, they're evidently the result of inhabitants seeking similar types of buildings, possibly working together as they were built, but not following a tightly defined plan. So are we seeing here an area of the town that was free of state involvement, where the first inhabitants, these buildings are built right on the alluvial surface of the island, where the first inhabitants were simply allowed to build dwellings as they required? Now, it is worth emphasising here that when Amara West was founded in the reign of Seti I, Egypt had administered this region, Upper Nubia, for nearly 2 centuries. So we must not assume that the inhabitants came from Egypt itself, which I think is often implicit in our narratives about New Kingdom Nubia. In fact, it's more likely they came from nearby settlements, whether other Egyptian towns or indeed elsewhere. Now, in many ways, this small example of individual household or community agency as the town was created would become the defining manner in shaping how the town subsequently developed. There was, of course, state-level engagement with Amara West later on. Under Ramses II, the temple was rebuilt, and indeed much of the town was levelled to create a new urban layout at this period. But thereafter, there's only a handful of officials leaving inscriptions in the temple. The town seemed to be being shaped in a bottom-up manner. Indeed, royal names are very rare on monuments in Nubia after Ramses III. Now, I've discussed elsewhere the shaping of the neighbourhood next to the deputy's residence that we're just going to fly through here, where storage buildings were demolished, adjusted, and repurposed to create a warren of small interlocking houses framed by narrow alleys, which is the one we're about to go down here, that paid no heed to the existing orientation of the town plan. Now, this neighbourhood and all the houses within it, so we're just about to enter a small house here, it's only 40 square metres in area. This neighbourhood and all the houses within it were embarking on an individual biography shaped by the requirements of its inhabitants, not the state or the central administration. Now, to move on, These early inhabitants threw their rubbish outside the town walls in the rubbish mounds off to the left of that slide, and in places created little garden plots. The presence of these small cluster of garden plots at different orientation again suggests the lack of state or administrative planning. The area outside the western town wall would, in late Dynasty 19, see the construction of a number of large villas, some as large as the upper echelon of houses known from Tel el Amarna, though without the extensive precincts around it. The one on the right, for example, is 400 square metres in area. Here again, there is no single plan, and soon the spaces between houses were colonised with additional smaller houses. The nature of the town was again being determined by its inhabitants and diverging further still from a planned state foundation. And amongst this suburban sprawl, a surprise, this oval building, E12.11, that falls within an indigenous Nubian architectural tradition, redolent of Kerma itself. Of unclear purpose, we don't know if it was a dwelling, used for ritual purposes or maybe for production purposes, it nonetheless sits next to the large villa I just showed you the plan of, and the pottery and artefacts are typical of the other houses of late Dynasty 19 and Dynasty 20. But clearly some of the inhabitants were comfortable with an architectural tradition or image reflecting Nubian cultural traditions, not the overwhelmingly Egyptian architecture that we find at the site. Now this building becomes even more interesting through the deployment of thin section micromorphology, one of those methods rarely used in Egypt due to restrictions on export samples. So Matthew Dalton at the University of Cambridge has led a programme of investigating the sedimentary and laid surfaces within our town, so principally the floors and walls coated in mud plaster, through removing small columns about this size of intact stratigraphy, curing them in resin back in the lab in Cambridge, and then analysing them under polarising microscope, revealing detailed insights into histories and activities in individual spaces. For example, tracking the presence of animals, seeing splashes of water on the same patch of floor, or even the replastering of a grinding installation 25 times. These are things that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Now, in building E1211, the oval, so-called Nubian building, we saw one, as macro-archaeologists with the naked eye, we saw one mud plaster floor. Matt's analysis revealed that there was actually 3 consecutive floors laid here with a very different material component compared to the floors in other buildings, much higher grass and chopped straw temper, for instance. Now, given the conscious deployment of a Nubian architectural layout, does this flooring also attest to the interweaving of indigenous practice in the surfaces within? Or were the users seeking a different floor type for other reasons, whether to do with its compaction, its durability, its tactility, or its temperature properties? Now, Matt's also been building on parallel research undertaken on contemporary, modern houses, traditional mud brick houses in the nearby village of Ernetta, including our own dig house, shown on the top right here. Now, this is obviously a culturally and historically very distinct context, but one where people were using the same range of natural materials and many of the same techniques as the ancient inhabitants. And what his work has shown on the current-day village is that there's very distinct recipes being used from one household to the other, with preferences for where the clay was being sourced from, the sand, and these preferences span generations within the same families. And strikingly, Matt has now identified similar phenomena at Mara West, with plaster recipes often consistent from room to room within a house, but very different from one house to the next, even 2 contemporary houses next door to each other. And this has also allowed us to identify significant changes in the use of spaces, even when the ground plan and the architecture hasn't changed at all. So this is allowing us to question, we don't know the names of the individuals, but it's allowing us to question how spaces were used and rethought across time. Now this line of research is allowing an appreciation of, again, the bottom-up agency in the town and the individuality of lived experience from person to person, but also from, be it family groups or community groups within the town. Another strand of research is looking at the technology and application of pigment within the urban environment, and this is at University College London. Now, colour has been an early focus of archaeometrical research within, for ancient Egypt for a long time, but has again focused on elite objects, often in museum collections, so looking at textiles, painted reliefs, Book of the Dead papyri, and so on. But with our discovery of a dump of material relating to pigment processing, possibly a painter's workshop or debris from there, including raw pigments, grinding stones, sherds used as pallets, we saw an opportunity to elucidate the whole process of processing and deploying colour within an urban environment, using various analytical techniques in the British Museum laboratories. Again, we integrated settlement spaces and cemeteries, as the poorly preserved coffins were painted in the same palette as that attested in the dump of materials within the town. Now, some of the results confirm expectations. Widespread use of red and yellow ochre, for instance, don't surprise anyone. But interestingly, the green is not copper-based, despite abundant amounts of copper and indeed metallurgy activity at the site. But rather, it uses a green earth, assumed to be prevalent only from Ptolemaic times in Egypt. The black is also unusual. Again, they didn't use charcoal, abundant across the site, but rather bitumen to paint across the coffins. Now, here are we seeing specifically local choices, conditioned perhaps by access to resources, but also the influence of local traditions? These are questions we're just beginning to look into. Egyptian blue, pictured on the bottom right, was used very sparingly, and we assume this has been imported from Egypt itself. Now, investigating production and technology inevitably leads us to ceramics, and the research into fabrics by Michela Spataro in our science department and Marie Millet, using petrography but also chemical analysis, has confirmed the local production of both Egyptian, and I say that in inverted commas, so wheel-thrown vessels in shapes familiar from contemporary Egypt, but also Nubian vessel forms, handmade, often basket-impressed. And both are being made at the site or nearby, often from the same clay paste, but it looks very different to the naked eye because of the production and how it's being fired. We're also finding imported ceramics, so picking up on what Stuart mentioned yesterday, including Mycenaean stirrup jars from the Greek mainland and Cyprus, reminding us that this remote site was plugged into a trade network that reached across the eastern Mediterranean. A simpler earth or clay technology was the moulding of wet clay into small female figurines, and here Anna Stevens' work has shown that while we have types very familiar from contemporary Egypt, such as those on the left, the kind of plaque-type female figurine, we also have a divergent group shown on the right, much more anthropomorphic in form, formed from two rolls of clay. And what's interesting here is these have become much more common in the later layers, still within the New Kingdom at the site. Again, underlining how inhabitants were both shaping the town and the cultural and religious traditions taking place within it. Now, obviously, we can't equate pottery with people, and the Nubian forms and technology, they at least attest the influence and integration within the life of the town of these Nubian traditions. But can we posit whether Nubians actually form part of the population? And I think here, again, picking up on what Stuart said yesterday, we have to be a bit careful with the designation of Egyptian and Nubian. It's a very narrow definition, especially in a town founded nearly 2 centuries after Upper Nubia had become formally annexed to the Egyptian Empire. That 6 or 7 generations of families had intermarried, created their own affiliation within these towns and the local landscape, while formulating their own memories and ancestral traditions, make it very difficult to persist with such sharp distinctions. As Stuart mentioned yesterday, building on the wider archaeology of colonialism, individuals could affiliate with distinct cultural traditions at different times and places as required. Now, the cemetery at Amara West provides a striking example of this. So I'm showing you here grave 244, one of our larger tombs. It's covered by a low circular mound, the tumulus, that most Nubian of grave markers. The individuals buried here, perhaps a family, were consciously choosing to commemorate the dead as affiliated with indigenous Nubian culture, and thereby ensure ongoing mortuary cult took place within that framework, not the rectangular chapel and pyramids found elsewhere with elite burials at Amara West. Yet beneath the ground, in the burial chambers not designed to be regularly accessed, an Egyptian cultural affiliation was preferred. Here, the multiple chambers, the grave goods, including 117 ceramic vessels, and treatment of the dead, extended burial, painted coffins, are consistent with practice in contemporary Egypt. Each year at the cemeteries of Amara West, where we just finished excavation last year, we come up with surprises. So I just wanted to show you this, largely because we're slightly perplexed as to what it is. This was found in the shaft, 7-meter deep rock-cut shaft of one of our largest pyramid tombs, and it was a series of large sandstone slabs, and as you can see on the left, depicting frontally an image of a figure with his arms crossed and wearing a tripartite wig. There's no uraeus. And at the bottom, shown in more traditional side view, a mourning figure. We don't know what these are. One of our working hypotheses is that they come from a built sarcophagus, built out of separate limestone slabs. It's too big to come from the burial chamber itself in terms of being wall decoration or anything like this. So if this is part of a built sarcophagus, are we seeing here an echo of the contemporaneous royal sarcophagi with engaged statues of an Osiris figure, such as that of Ramses III in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge? Or are we seeing another divergent tradition in this ostensibly Egyptian stronghold? And this tomb, by the way, is dated to the early 20th dynasty. Now, H.W. Fairman, director of the first seasons of Amara West in the late 1930s, recognised that the town lay upon an ancient island on the basis of topography, particularly a dried-up river channel that skirts its northern edge, separating the housing areas from the burial grounds. Now, from early in our research project, we've integrated paleo-environmental research led by Jamie Woodward and Mark Macklin, specialists in the long-term dynamics of the Middle Nile from the Pleistocene through the Holocene. Combining shuttle radar imagery with ground-penetrating radar survey, we've managed to map the course, the depth, and the shape of the channel. And a series of sondages into this channel bed exposed interleaved aeolian sand layers and Nile flood deposits that you can see on the bottom right. And we undertook AMS C14 dating of the charcoal, but also optically stimulated luminescence dating of the sand deposits. And what's really striking about this is we've been able to show that perennial flow in this channel stopped sometime between 1380 and 1270 BC, i.e. around the time of the town's foundation, most likely within a generation of its being founded. Now, this correlates very well with river data from elsewhere in Sudan, notably in the Dongola Reach. The channel did flood several more times with the darker brown layers, but this was intermittent throughout the rest of the New Kingdom and just afterwards. Now, the impact of this channel failure would have been considerable. No longer would the town have been protected from the Saharan sand ingress carried by the high northerly winds, as there was no body of water to trap airborne sand, nor would the 15-metre high riverside sand dunes and their acacia and tamarisk trees provide further protection. Going back to the micromorphology, Matt has analysed samples from the alleyways in our town, and we can see in the latest phases, so in the Dynasty 20, sometimes 60% of the deposits are made up of windblown sand, where earlier they were dominated by material eroded out of the mud brick walls. And the botanical record also evokes the changing environmental challenges, as we find a rare form of 6-row barley acting like a 2-row barley, assumed to be a response to aridity, where parts of the grain remain sterile. And then this is picked up through the bioarchaeological record. So Michaela Binder, who's now at the Austrian Archaeological Institute, has been studying our human remains. And what we find with our post-New Kingdom skeletons is there's a drastic increase in lung infections, undoubtedly exacerbated by the increase in airborne particles, and notably higher incidences of dental loss, caries, and abscesses. And this is all hinting at a changed diet, more trauma and joint degeneration, suggestive of increasingly strenuous physical activities, perhaps reflecting the enhanced effort needed to sustain agriculture and maintain livestock. Now, there is no evidence that the state or the town administration undertook measures to mitigate any of these issues. The town was neither abandoned, contrary to standard Egyptological narratives, nor radically reimagined. The walled town and temple continued to face north into the sand, the windborne sand, towards the dried up channel. Rather, we see it's at individual or household level that, again, there is a more prominent role played. So this is just an example of a house where the doorways are continually modified with sand traps, and staircases had to be built down into the living level of the houses, and generally north-facing doorways were closed off. And eventually, and I should stress, long after the Egyptian state had ceded control of this area of Nubia, the last inhabitants must have left. The last burial in our cemetery is 8th century BC, so over 200 years after the end of the New Kingdom. And presumably these individuals were then seeking a sand-free, healthier, more sustainable living environment. And even today, as you can see on this Google Earth view, the East Bank, or it's actually the South Bank here, remains the focus of human settlement to the present day. And I think it was the community, the households, and the individuals who were making these decisions, not the very distant Pharaonic state. And again, I think we need to move away from this idea of the Pharaonic state losing control of sites like this and everyone packing up their bags and going back to Egypt. Why would they go back to Egypt? I just want to finish with a few words on the modern local community and their agency. The archaeological project, like I think nearly all archaeological projects, is one admittedly conceived, planned, and other than our field seasons, largely taking place within obscure offices within the British Museum and other collaborating institutions. Funding bodies, of course, shape the project, as successful grant applications are, of course, tailored towards the particular funding calls or the funding body, and the success or failure of such applications will alter the focus of given field seasons. For example, for the last few years, we've been funded by the Qatar Sudan Archaeological Project, who have asked us to place increased emphasis on site security and site preservation. But what of the local community in all this? Now, this is a site with few visible remains once the sand fills up the excavated buildings, and no standing monuments. The temple is still buried. Very few visitors go there. Yet we've witnessed really high levels of interest among inhabitants in the surrounding area, not only in the small village we live in, but also the nearby town of Abri. We started with an introductory book to the site in 2014, that's the one depicted on the top left, It was richly illustrated and designed to appeal to a wide audience. I think it might be useful to undergraduates in university studying Egyptology, also to general readers. But we didn't change the text for the Arabic edition, and this was distributed freely amongst the local villages, 1,000 copies. And it was actually very well received, in fact too well received. We were often asked the question, when is your next book coming out? As if it was going to be a kind of yearly occurrence. But three aspects of the local response really struck us. First was the wide range of interested readers, from primary school children to professionals to those without a formal education, and both men and women. Secondly was how closely it was read. Some of the comments came back almost as if they were copy editors or proofreaders. But I think it's important that we shouldn't assume these rural communities need some dumbed-down version of the content we produce for academic or implicitly Western audiences. I think I bring to mind here the short Arabic abstracts that often sit above scholarly articles in journal. It's a nod towards engaging with local scholarly audiences, but there's little substance to it. And I realise there are funding restrictions to all of this. But I think most importantly for us, in terms of the reception of the book, we were surprised by which parts of the book resonated most with the local readers. And it wasn't about ancient Egyptian conquest and occupation, which I thought might actually be a contentious issue locally. They weren't interested as much in the history, the kings, the temples, or the valuable burial goods. Rather, again and again, we were asked questions about diet, health, and how things were made. And people noted continuities, whether expressed positively, for example, local traditions, Nubian culture, integration within the landscape, or expressed in negative terms, so people asking us questions whether the respiratory problems, the cancer case, the physical strain experienced by the ancient inhabitants was something that they would continue to experience living in traditional houses. Building on the book, we are now working on a range of other outputs developed in consultation with the local communities, talks in local clubs, on-site visits and activities for primary schools, largely led by our local excavators, which will lead to a children's book published next year. As in Egypt, school curricula in Sudan foreground a national history of great men and wars, not the local histories, sacred spaces and landscapes that surround the modern-day inhabitants. And I think archaeological projects have an opportunity, maybe even a responsibility, to fill that gap, and that applies equally in Egypt. I think the spread of smartphones also offers opportunities. We engage with our workers in the local community with WhatsApp and Facebook, and distribute video podcasts narrated in Nubian. Now, obviously these aren't pertinent in Egypt, but it's interesting that a technology solution is allowing us to sidestep the problem of a language that the Sudanese government has actively campaigned against, and that people don't read in a script. It's not written down anymore. So technology is very useful in that sense. I was going to show you a clip from that podcast, but I'm having video problems, so I can show anyone who's interested later. And we've also done Arabic language podcasts, as well as English ones as well, and they're freely available on the web. And I just want to finish by saying that as archaeologists, I think we must ensure our outputs both engage with these communities and reflect how we are embedded in those communities as our fieldwork takes place. And I think it's really interesting for us that we found that not only the wider subject of archaeology, but also our host communities seem increasingly interested in a bottom-up view of these ancient towns and its lived experience, rather than thinking of the great men and the states that we usually foreground in our narratives. So I just finish off by thanking all of those who've worked on the project, but also funded the project since 2008. So thank you.
Okay. Our discussant for this section will be Andrew Dufton, who's a doctoral candidate here at the Joukowsky Institute. He studied at McGill University and then went on to get a master's degree in GIS and spatial analysis, so I think he's particularly appropriate for this section on geographical boundaries. He's currently preparing his dissertation on the transition from the Iron Age settlement to Roman urbanism in North Africa, drawing on modern urban anthropology to ask how this process takes place. And keep the thing going here so we all get to lunch.
Right. Close this, but I don't have any slides, and I'm aware we're running a little bit late, and I think the discussion is often some of the sort of strongest elements of State of the Field, so I'll try and keep these comments relatively brief. As Susan said, my research is in North Africa, and also for my sins, I organized the previous State of the Field conference on North Africa, or as Jen pointed out yesterday, the State of the Field conference on North Africa without Egypt. So I think it's sort of interesting to start with some context about State of the Field, how these conferences have come into place, and some sort of ongoing geographic tensions that are sort of implicit to them and that are explicitly discussed in this session. So as people have said repeatedly, and I won't go into too much details with here, State of the Field have covered Italy, Turkey, Greece, Siberia, North Africa, and Egypt, and you can sort of see this moving between geographic boundaries of modern countries and larger regions. On the one hand, we try and talk about things that are problems with current fieldwork, current research practices, local collaborations, and those things are often set based on modern political boundaries. Permitting is different in Egypt than it is in Sudan, than it is in Libya, etc. On the other hand, thematic questions obviously don't care so much about where the modern boundaries of Egypt may end or whether Tunisia and Algeria have different working conditions. And so there is this sort of ongoing tension between how we as scholars position ourselves either within modern political boundaries or broader intellectual or thematic boundaries. I'll admit to having a little bit of personal hesitance. I am woefully and admittedly ignorant of much of the archaeology of Egypt. So discussing two papers on the archaeology of Egypt is a little daunting. Thankfully, and I guess to reiterate what Ian said earlier, the speakers made my job very easy. Reading over these papers before they were speaking, I found myself sort of frantically scribbling in the margins, a lot of the yes, exclamation point, underlining things. There are really quite a few resonances with research in North Africa and also actually my research in other places in the Mediterranean. I guess starting with Neal's paper about Amaro West and his sort of discussion of these bottom-up processes of urbanism. There were a lot of yeses and exclamation marks for that. That's exactly how I sort of think about, or my research is exploring the process of Roman urbanism in North Africa and this kind of idea of local improvisation in the colonial city, of this departure from foundations into what actually happens on the ground after the foundation force leaves. These questions of imperial power, I think, speak very broadly to not just Egypt and not just pushing the geographic boundaries of Egyptology outside of Egypt, the modern nation, but also sort of speaking to people outside of the field of Egyptology altogether. Both in terms of, I guess, North African urbanism or Roman urbanism, but really, I mean, I was sort of thinking when I was reading this of questions of the colonial city more generally. The work of Shannon Dottie, who talks about colonial New Orleans, uses this term of Creole generations to talk about the generations after the founders and how they're interacting with local traditions, and how the centuries after you see these kind of ideas that people may have gone, in her case in New Orleans, she's talking about a lot of what people would think they would be eating or farming when they went to New Orleans from France, but then of course like New Orleans is not France, and so they'd make these decisions on the ground, and it was this very improvisational colonial contact or colonial situations. And I think that this is one example of Egypt that can enter into dialogues across regions, across chronological boundaries. If with Neal's paper it was about, yay, urbanism, bottom up, with Gregory's paper, the yeses, the exclamation points were very much along the lines of process, of questions of methodology, of the fact that it's great to talk about working in the frontiers, but frontiers in the past are often frontiers right now, and that presents a lot of questions of security, particularly in the post-Arab Spring world. It presents questions of new technologies, questions of fieldwork, questions of permitting, because often fieldwork permitting is not necessarily aware of the fact that new technologies might require different types of things. Drones, also in North Africa, they don't really love you to bring in drones for whatever reason. And so there is this sort of question of what we're doing to push methodological boundaries. And I know that that's a session that is going to happen after lunch, and so I don't want to steal the thunder of those people. But I was sort of thinking of this idea of mapping of heritage at risk in particular, using satellite imagery, and the work of the Endangered Archaeology of Middle East and North Africa project, which is based out of Oxford and Leicester, amongst other places. And sort of this tension between the need to map this heritage at risk and have some idea of identifying new sites and tracing things like looting or development, but also the fact that I have a personal interest in the fact that most of these technologies are also largely derived from military operations, things like 3D reconstructions of things to present them in Western audiences. I mean, there's a potential for using digital tools to recreate colonial sort of discourses with the past that we've dismissed in other realms. So hopefully we can touch on that maybe later today. And sort of, I guess, to wrap up with a couple of points about North Africa specifically, and the questions or research questions about North Africa. I think these two papers have done a good job of talking about pushing the study of Egypt sort of as a civilization, as an entity beyond its current geographic boundaries. I think there's also a question of pushing the geographic boundaries into Egypt. So sort of archaeology in Egypt as modern geographic region as opposed to archaeology of Egyptian things, whatever those may be, which as we see are chronologically and geographically diverse. A lot of questions about what's going on in North Africa involve specifically Egypt as a geographic territory. Andy Wilson and Lisa Fentress have a paper forthcoming about using sort of modern Berber dialects to look at the migrations of people into North Africa in, I guess, the second millennium. I don't know the dates off the top of my head. And how those people sort of then emerged into the Numidian kingdoms in North Africa. David Mattingly and the UNESCO-funded Libyan Valleys Survey looking at the Garamantes. Again, a lot of talk is of the position of the Garamantes as a north-south trade route between the Mediterranean and the Sahara, but of course they're also positioned on an east-west trade route. And if the west of that is North Africa or southern Algeria, the east is Egypt. There's also a question of the lack of Bronze Age in North Africa, and there's a lovely sort of emotive passage in Cyprian Broodbank's latest book of Brodel and the biplane flying over the Mediterranean and North Africa, and the Bronze Age is obscured by fog. And we wish we could pull the fog back and have some idea. And some of the North African scholars specifically who talk about the lack of bronze material, specifically bronze material, are making references to things in Egypt or evidence in Egypt for interactions between these mysterious Libyans that we know very little about. Gabriel Comp in his Encyclopédie Berber makes a mention of an inscription at Karnak of the Libyans coming with their bronze weapons to presumably fight with Egyptians. And the fact of the matter is I have no idea of what that might mean because I don't know anything about Egypt, and I imagine that a lot of people studying Egypt might not care that much about who these mysterious Libyans are, other than the fact that they're interacting with Egypt, but it's really a call to the need to be breaking down these geographic boundaries because there's so many questions. And these are just earlier examples Ian was talking about later. I mean, the Muslim conquest, they conquest North Africa, but they also move through Egypt, which they also conquer. The Ottoman Empire, there's these questions that we need to break down both chronological and geographic boundaries to have some idea of how we're going to answer them. And I think with an eye on the clock and an ear to people's grumbling stomachs, I'll leave it at that. But hopefully we'll have enough time for a little bit of discussion about this sort of session.
How much time do we?
Oh, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. I think we could go to 45 and cut the lunch break maybe 50 minutes short. Yes.
Well, let's see how long we go. Ian.
Thank you all for this wonderful session. I want to pose something to both of you in terms of thinking about boundaries, and that's water boundaries. Because one of the things that I thought was interesting in Neal, in your case, right? You know, people are being forced to deal with crossing a water boundary out of necessity, whereas in your case, Gregory, there's a desire to actually cross that water boundary, either to get onto the other side of the Red Sea and set up a fortress, or to use water as a vehicle. So I'm wondering how you think, right? And, you know, because in many ways we've talked about breaking boundaries in terms of breaking down the boundaries, you know, of Egypt and its relationship to other civilizational areas, but how about, you know, the way in which, you know, the state or, you know, local communities are pushing at or being pushed to cross the hydraulic boundaries that they face.
Well, on my side, for all these expeditions, we had no choice. We have to cross the Red Sea because the only copper deposit is in the Sinai. Something interesting about the location of the two harbors that I show you in Sokhna and Wadi al-Jarf. The first harbor of the system is located just opposite to the mining area. So it's the shortest. For that site, we have just to cross 50 kilometers. So it looks like that we cross a huge part of the desert in order to have a very short strait of sea to cross. But a few years after that, when they settle in Sokhna, they are in a much better location because we are closer to the Memphis area. So the path through the desert is smaller, and the section by navigation is 3 times longer. So it means in between we are not afraid to cross, in between these two sides we are not afraid to cross a much longer section on the Red Sea. They just got, I think, we have no records for that, but they got more confidence in their
The
navigation.
infrastructure gets built up, right? I mean, it required an intensive infrastructure buildup with all the
Yeah, well, the Wadi al-Jarf, we're still in a digest process for that site, but the Wadi al-Jarf was settled as probably too much larger. There's too much installation, it's too big. And Sokhna is something in better proportion for what they want for doing this expedition. What else? No, is that answering, you know?
Catherine, weigh in on the harbor people.
Yes, okay.
No,
Yes,
no,
it's your turn. It's your turn to speak. Yes. We've excavated at Marsa Wadi Gawasis, the remaining Middle Kingdom harbor, and it was 150 kilometers across the desert, which all the equipment, food, materials, boat were taken. And then the distance on the Red Sea was perhaps 800 kilometers to the south. So these expeditions required very complex operational logistics. And they were going probably to 2 different locations, so I leave it to you. Be a point and point.
Okay, no, I wanted to answer to your question firstly, which is more question. Why they were navigating, at least in the Middle Kingdom, from for about 800 up to 1,000 kilometers to the southern sea, okay? For a very simple reason, to bypass Kerma and the Kush, Kingdom of Kush. They had to bypass, and we know from excavations that they conducted 25 years ago in the castle area that Kerma up to the region up to the lowlands, western lowlands of Eritrea, Kerma had a kind of monopoly. We found in the castle area mainly Kerma stuff, imported stuff, okay? But we know now that also, thanks to all the excavations I did, but mainly with the recent excavation of Andrea Manzo, who found in castle again a lot of Middle Kingdom ceramics. So anyway, the reason they were navigating for such a long, they chose the sea routes was mainly to bypass Kerma, which was the biggest intermediary along the Nile.
I think we can't project our discomfort in crossing, vast distances of desert, with no water. They were building the pyramids. They had the infrastructure. They had the organization. They were perfectly capable of transporting large pieces of wood from Lebanon into the pyramid, into the Red Pyramid or the Bent Pyramid. Why these places are where they are, or the economic or infrastructure restrictions, we can't look at them from a modern point of view. Next, Pierce.
I'd like to add to that we should apply that mentality to the maritime world. It's been 100 years since current contemporary people have really had an intense association with the water. And at the times when these harbors are changing, the Egyptians are regularly experimenting with different types of sailing technologies. You see it in the iconographic record. And they're trying something and then abandoning that technology and going to the next. And by the time you get to the Middle Kingdom, they seem to have it largely sorted out. But we have to be aware with these maritime spheres that we don't really understand the maritime world and even the way that scholars approach it as well as we need to, because we don't go on boats anymore. Anybody in the room actually know how to sail? I mean,
You're in Rhode Island. You're in Rhode Island.
so 4 people put their hands up in New
Well,
England. I mean, but
Well, one from California.
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean,
that
go-
kind of thing. It's-
Go, if you ever get a chance, go to the Whaling Museum in New Bedford and get an idea of what, and in a huge maritime industry that sailed to some of the most climatically challenged places in the world quite efficiently. Another comment? Comments? Stuart?
Yeah, so obviously I like Neal's paper very much with the bottom-up approach, and I think this is really an important point that the state may come in and build these enclosures, or in the case of the Middle Kingdom fortresses, for example, all these gridded out barracks kind of housing units, but then people come in and their goals aren't necessarily aligned exactly with what the state envisions, and they start modifying, rebuilding, breaking through walls, adapting to suit their own needs and their own desires. And yeah, I think that's a really neat dynamic you can really see at Amara West, but also at other sites too. Even monumental structures, temples and things like that. We had the example mentioned of temples being converted into churches. And these sacred spaces change over time. They're not just static. They were built with a certain vision, but then those purposes, the uses might change over time and be adapted again, as much from the bottom up as from the state imposing and modifying.
Okay, well, we won't, Emily.
I was just going to say that also ties in nicely with Gregory's paper, because for the island settlement, one of the really interesting, that grid plan, the theater, those are all, in theory, you look at them and they're Greco-Roman aspects, but until you start digging, you don't know, again, how much of that is imposed by new government exterior influences, and how much then you have of adaptation within the city. And you see that in a lot of any of the Greco-Roman settlements in the Fayum as well. You start out maybe with some kind of grid, and as you move out, it's that adaptation that you get. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that set.
Jen, you want to say something about lunch?
No, but first, thank you everyone who participated
Yes.
in this session.
It's been very